The epistle to the Ephesians. This is an interesting one, historically speaking, as it is the one that there is the most debate about on who wrote it. But before we get into that, the main message of Ephesians is church unity, being one in the body, one in the faith. It is written during a time of great turmoil. This is Paul is in prison. He's probably in prison in Rome, possibly in Caesarea, but most likely in Rome. This would be about the year 61. He's taken from Caesarea to Rome about 61, so late 61, maybe early 62. That's when he's writing this epistle. The Christians are starting to be persecuted more, and the division between Jew and Gentile is starting to grow again. And so he writes this epistle. But scholars disagree. Scholars don't think that Paul wrote this epistle. Most scholars do not believe that Paul wrote this epistle. I go with the prophets, and the prophets have all stated that this was written by Paul. So I don't find any need to question that. But what do the scholars say? Well, the main reason that scholars think that Paul didn't write it is because it seems to be in a different writing style than the rest of the epistles of Paul. And so they use textual criticisms to say, well, this doesn't sound like Paul, so Paul didn't write it. So just briefly, the theories about who wrote it are, first, of course, there's still the acceptance that Paul wrote it. It's a very much minority among scholars, but that's what I believe, that's what I accept, so we have to put that there. The next theory is that Paul wrote it in conjunction with one or more co-authors, which would explain the difference in writing style. So maybe somebody else was writing a letter and they asked Paul's opinion about some of the doctrine. And so Paul explained the doctrine to them, they wrote it down and sent it out. Something like that. Another theory is that Paul had nothing to do with it, but that it was written by a later follower of Paul, like in the year 80 or 90, and they just wrote Paul's name on it to give it an air of authority. And finally, there are those who simply say, we just don't have enough information to actually make an informed conclusion as to who wrote it. So those are your options. As I said, I think Paul wrote it because that's what the prophets have said. There are a couple other things, though, about this epistle that might be true, actually sounds kind of true, and that is, first of all, in this epistle there are no personal greetings, no mention of names of friends or anything like that. There's just this one reference to Ephesus at the beginning. Now, in our earliest manuscripts, this reference is not there. There is no reference to Ephesus in the earliest manuscripts that we have found. And, of course, those manuscripts are like 300 years after the death of Paul, so there's only so much you can do with that. But this has given rise to two basic theories. One, that the letter to the Ephesians is actually the letter to the Laodiceans mentioned in Colossians, and that it was mislabeled later on. But the better theory, in my opinion, is that it was meant as a circular letter that was meant to be read in multiple churches. So he's sending it to all these congregations in the Asia Minor area. Ephesians is probably the first one it goes to, since it's kind of a central point. But no name is given on these earlier manuscripts because the one carrying the letter was meant to stand up and read it in their Sabbath meeting, and it was the name of the church was just left blank. So he'd stand up in Ephesus and read to the saints in Ephesus. And then he'd go to Laodicea and say, to the saints in Laodicea. Go to Antioch and read to the saints in Antioch. And it was given the label of the Ephesians later on, maybe because it was first read in Ephesus, maybe because that is where it was best preserved. But for whatever reason, it is now the letter to the Ephesians. But it was originally meant to be read in multiple congregations. That is very possibly true. I don't know, and I don't think the Joseph Smith translation really helps us with that. Even though it leaves in that salutation to the Ephesians, all that means is that the copy we have had the writing to the Ephesians. It doesn't mean that there weren't other copies or that the original wasn't circulated more. Now, a brief history of the Ephesian church. See, Paul on his second missionary journey, he first goes through Galatia and then up north, crossing into Macedonia and down into Greece, where he stops in Athens and then Corinth. In Corinth, he meets Aquila and Priscilla, who have just left Rome. They then all travel together to Ephesus. Paul stays here for 3 months, establishing the first church of Ephesus before heading off to Antioch in Syria. While he's in Antioch, Apollos comes up from Egypt to Ephesus, where he is instructed by Aquila and Priscilla, and they strengthen the church there, and Apollos moves on to Greece. A year or so later, Paul leaves Antioch in Syria and comes out to Ephesus, where he stays for about 3 years, strengthening the church there, building up, teaching in all the areas of Asia, which is the western coast of Asia Minor. Then he goes up into Macedonia again, down through to Corinth, and on his way back, he stops off in Miletus, which is on the southern end of the west coast there, and he has a final meeting with the saints in Ephesus before heading back to Jerusalem, where he is arrested. So up to this point, this is the church in Ephesus. This is one place. He stayed here longer than any other single place on any of his missionary journeys, and from here built up the church in all the area around it. This became a major center of the church in Asia. So that is the history of the church in Ephesus and a summary of the epistle, what it is and what its main message is. But why is Paul writing it at this time? Well, I don't think there was any specific event that prompted Paul to write this epistle. I think he's writing because the early 60s, the persecution against the Christians is starting to increase. And in 64, there will be the Great Fire of Rome, after which the persecution of Christians gears up, goes into overdrive. And Paul, I think, is writing this preemptively to try and strengthen the saints, to keep them united for what is coming. Now, there is still the division of Jew versus Gentile that has not completely gone away. And there are other, so there are persecutions and divisions within the church at this time. And I think that Paul is just trying to hold the people together. We know that the great apostasy will happen shortly after the apostles' death. And I think we are seeing signs of it here, that Paul is addressing these things because he can see what's coming. And he at least wants to hold on to those that he has personally taught and has personally brought to baptism, even though he knows that their descendants will fall away. He's trying to hold on to those that he knows personally. But now we will read the epistle to the Ephesians.